Assalamu alaikum. I'm Zainab Idris, and on behalf of the Hall School of Economics, I would like to invite you all on the second day of 6th International Conference on Applied Development Economics. I warmly welcome you all. Now I wanted to invite Dr. Jonathan Morduch. He will be delivering his plenary talk on the topic, What is Poverty? Jonathan Morduch is a professor of public policy and economics at New York University. His research primarily explores finance, poverty, and inequality. Dr. Morduch is also the founder and executive director of the New York University Financial Assets Initiative. This session will be chaired by Dr. Teresa, who is the professor of economics and the co-director of Innovation Technology Center at the Hall School of Economics. Over to you, Dr. Morduch and Dr. Teresa.
Good morning, and thanks to everyone who is coming in today. I have the pleasure of chairing the session for Professor Jonathan Morduch. And just a couple of words before he comes up. I just wanted to say that while most economists want to do their empirical work to address important questions, and others get caught up in questions that are just interesting or cool, I think Professor Morduch's work has done both, has been able to achieve both. So let me just illustrate that with a brief anecdote. I recall very few of the very long seminars that I sat through as a graduate student at the University of Maryland back in the late 90s, but I do recall Professor Morduch taking a deep dive into the data of microfinance banks and exploring why Romanian had such high repayment rates. Other research of this has uncovered things like hidden gender discrimination, and child health data, and more recently he's been looking at how to make field experience and RCTs more policy relevant. So I'm looking very much forward to hearing Professor Morduch's plenary address. So I invite him to please begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. It's such a pleasure to be here. Really a privilege. So thank you for this invitation. And really this opportunity to reflect on a set of ideas that I've been thinking through maybe some level since the time that we had that seminar in Maryland decades ago, I'm afraid to say. This talk actually draws on some newer work along similar themes. It's joined with Josh Morduch, who's based at the Korea Development Institute School. And we're continuing to do this work, so it's quite new, and I look forward to your feedback. The topic that I want to discuss today, share some thoughts on, is really at some level about the ideas that as economists and development economists we adopt, we hold. And poverty seems like a very simple idea. It is at some level a very simple idea. And yet when you go back and you think about it, it could have taken different forms. It could have been defined in different ways. But in the late 19th century, early 20th century, particularly in Britain, based on work that was being done there, this idea of poverty as living below a poverty line for the year, that idea came together. And since then, we've been living with this idea of poverty. And today, I want to try to take it apart. In some sense, to go back to maybe what it would have been like before the 19th century. In many ways, maybe talking about this in Pakistan it won't seem so foreign to put forward the idea that we live under a construct that came to us through the context of Victorian England, Imperial England, and somehow we've stayed with those ideas and constructs today, and we live with them and work with them. And in this small slice, thinking about poverty, I want to take it apart. Now, there are a lot of conversations about poverty.
That word gets used in lots of ways. Most recently, many of you are familiar with the multidimensional poverty index. It's calculated, of course, here in Pakistan. And that notion of poverty is much more expansive than the conventional notion, right? Including dimensions of health and education and standards of living. But I'm not going to talk about that. I want to really focus on a more conventional understanding of poverty in terms of material resources. Do households have enough money, enough resources to meet their basic needs? The MBPI is extremely valuable, and I think perhaps it's more valuable together with a broader notion of that more narrow notion of poverty. In many ways, this conversation, or the way I got to the ideas I want to share in the next hour, next 45 minutes, come from thinking about the economics of household finance, or household economics. And a lot of the papers that we saw yesterday were really coming out of that frame, household economics. Those conversations are often kept distinct from poverty analysis in its sort of pure form. That's really the terrain of measurement experts and statistical experts who are really very focused on nationally representative samples and have their own kind of siloed conversation about what that looks like. And it's often really separated from the kind of richness of conversation we had yesterday about people's behaviors and constraints and strategies and impacts of policies. In many ways, what I want to do is bring those closer in a particular way. And I want to start by going back to an idea that I've worked on in various ways over the years called financial diaries. Financial diaries came out of a kind of intellectual crisis, or a personal intellectual crisis. Just thinking about poverty, teaching poverty, as we all do, I think, if we teach development economics, we have some section on poverty. And we show some data that looks like this. This is the story of poverty over time as calculated by the World Bank in this instance, starting in the 1990s and going up to today. And it's a remarkable accomplishment of humanity, really, that over these decades, our world has radically been transformed. It's still a work in progress. But in the early 1990s, about 2 billion people around the planet lived on under sort of the equivalent of $2 a day today, in international dollars. Right? We all know that. So 38% of the planet, according to World Bank calculations. And even in 2000, it was still not so different. The fraction had changed, but the absolute number was maintained. And the intellectual crisis came from not being able to explain to my students or to myself what it meant like, what it must be like to live on so little. This is $2 a day in international prices was meant to account for purchasing power, differences in purchasing power between, say, a village in Pakistan and New York City. Maybe not quite New York, but someplace in the United States. And that question was never really being asked, how do people live on so little? How do you feed your children? How do you pay for education? How do you maintain health care? How do you do all the things in life that need to be done? In some sense, it was a very simple question, but when I went to the policy folks, they weren't really in that world. Now, yesterday, presentations were grappling with those questions in different ways, actually. And my response at this point in the early 2000s was to join in with a series of other researchers to really just spend time in poor villages and poor informal settlements in the cities, just spending time with families, tracking what they did over the year, every couple of weeks, having simple interviews about everything they earned, spent, saved, shared, borrowed, really get a full sense of what it looked like to live on so little. That led to a series of studies, really motivated by this simple question. How can you live on so little when $2.15, if you think about it, the international poverty line can't even buy a cup of coffee. those possibilities came from the intuition of this idea that money, that amount of money is so little that households living on income below that poverty line must be living hand to mouth, must lack to be able to save or think about the future, can't really be having much of a financial life at all. And it turned out, perhaps not surprising to you, but more broadly, that those ideas were more wrong than right. That in fact, people were focusing very heavily on saving and borrowing, not despite being poor, but because of the nature of their poverty. Because poverty was not a steady state. And I wanted to show some data and then connect it to poverty measurement. But I thought the easiest way to share this idea with you is to start with the data from a particular woman who lives in a village north of Dhaka in Bangladesh. Had it not been for the student protests, I would have been visiting Rishipara last week. It's an area in which Stuart Rutherford and his colleagues have been spending time with a small group of households tracking their daily spending for almost 9 years now, every single day. It's an incredible resource, but a very small number of households. It's the kind of data that as economists we don't usually use. We like big data sets, many households, but we just see them for a short time. But this is sort of the opposite. So I want to just show you some data for a woman named Kabani who's a widow and raising two young children. She's among the poor members of the village, of the community. She earns a little money, mostly sorting vegetables in the market. She lives in a very small house, not large enough for a toilet. She uses a neighbor's toilet. And if we only had data on her, and we were thinking in terms of global poverty, this is the global poverty line, this is a 2-year period in Kabani's life, we would characterize the condition of her poverty graphically in an image like this. This is Kabani's average spending over the year. And you can see the first year is slightly below the international poverty line, and then the next year doing a little bit better, but still below the poverty line. And so in terms of Kabani's poverty, we're going to classify her. We say she's always poor in this period. In the sort of head count 0-1 way, she's ones all the way across. Based on her annual average spending, based on the definitions we conventionally use. But the data allow us to see a much more fine-grained version of Kabani's life. Here I've taken the daily data and aggregated it up to months, and you can see that there are times when Kabani's expenditure is substantially above the poverty line. There are months when it's substantially below the poverty line. And the beginning point for my thoughts today is that Kabani's life is in many ways sort of captured by the conventional notion of poverty. She is indeed lacking resources overall. But also important parts of her life are hidden. Both the highs and the lows, the opportunities and the constraints. And we get a very, very different view. And Kabani's poverty is very fluid. She moves in and out of poverty depending on seasons, circumstances, whether she can get more work or not, what's happening with her family. And there are moments where the depth of her poverty is averaged out of the conventional approach. So this sort of set of simple thoughts led to a way of thinking about poverty, and then relate it to poverty measurement in a more technical way. But the way that we came, and my colleagues, I'm thinking of Darrell Collins and Orlando Ruffin and Stuart Rutherford and myself, as we were putting together some thoughts on financial values, was that to capture at least the material conditions of poverty, we have to start with insufficiency of resources, the sort of central concern. But to really understand people's choices, you need to also pay attention to instability, changing conditions through the year, highs and lows of seasons. Because the challenges of poverty, the material challenges, are not just those average conditions, but also the movements in those resources. And then illiquidity. How easy is it to get hold of the money that you need to meet your needs? In many ways, it's possible that if people didn't have that instability, if they could just literally earned $2.15 a day through the year, their lives would actually could be much better. That was a beginning. 2 weeks ago, I was in Mumbai. I was talking to a migrant who moved to Mumbai from Bihar, and the conversation came around to poverty. We were talking about all kinds of things. We came around to poverty, and we were saying, there are people who are better off, who are still poor, and there are people who are worse off, who are still poor. And I kind of tried to pull out how he was thinking of that. And what he said is, well, really what poverty is to him was when you can't get the money you need when you need it. He bound up with a sense of illiquidity. So, I'm going to take those ideas. These are ideas that I'm going to use them to dive into thinking about a conventional notion of poverty. I want to introduce a different notion of poverty, a high-frequency notion of poverty that captures this instability. And then what I want to argue is that even though that high-frequency notion of poverty that I'm going to share with you, even though it seems infeasible to collect data, who can collect data every couple weeks, or every month, or even every quarter on households over the year, I want to show you that an approximation of that poverty measure is feasible. And not only that, I want to show you that actually in many countries, what we think of as poverty, what we call poverty, actually is this high frequency measure. It's a little bit of a leap, but I want to see if we can walk through it. So the conventional concept of poverty is familiar to everyone, right? When we teach our students this, we have distribution, we have a poverty line, and usually there are different forms of poverty measures, but they usually take this form that it's just some average over the population of a function of your average income, your total income, total expenditure for the year. And that's how we think about it, and then poverty, thanks to Amartya Sen's focus axiom, sort of just focus on the poorest part of the population. So we have this basic form, it's a measure. We're going to come back to that, but I think that's a familiar idea. And this is the idea here in Kabati's data. So I want to show you something with some hypothetical data. I think it's easier to show up with hypothetical data, and I'm going to make some points for this data. So I made up this data. It's not real data. But what it is down the left-hand side are 12 households, and across the top are 12 months. So I've got 144 observations for these 12 households. And you can see in the top left-hand corner, January, the first household, their average consumption for that month was $4 a day. Those are the units. So 7 things in dollars a day per person, so $4 a day per person. So not poor that month. Then February comes along, and their average consumption was $3 a day, so not poor that month, at least according to the extreme World Bank poverty measure of $3.19. But in March, it just slipped below the poverty line. In April, still below the poverty line, and you can see it continues. So with this conventional approach, there are 3 households that would be considered poor in this data. And those are considered poor based on data on the far right-hand column, which is their average consumption over the year. Because that's all that matters in the conventional approach. These other households, like the one in the first row, their poverty is averaged out with their better times, and there's an offset, and so we don't really count that poverty as poverty. And the question I've been asking myself and with Josh Marco was how should we think about that, and can we bring those experiences of poverty into a measurement frame? So this way of thinking about it, at 25% of the population being poor. And that kind of measure we describe as being time insensitive, in the sense that it doesn't matter when you receive consumption. It could be all on one day of the year, it could be spread through the year. It doesn't matter, the timing of consumption doesn't matter, the way that we conventionally calculate poverty. Because of that, lean seasons don't have any particular content in the conventional measure of poverty. And because of that, the kind of policies that we talk about when trying to eradicate poverty, to address the World Bank first Sustainable Development Goal, eradicate extreme poverty, all of those are about changing the average, moving the average, economic growth, better jobs, increasing our income. Incredibly important policies. Big challenges. I'm not going to discount them. What I want to argue is that they're not enough if we want to actually reduce experiences of poverty. And this idea is very easy to explain. It's a relatively simple policy to describe. And this is the idea, as economists, that we work with in poverty. It's the idea that runs through Martin Valiant's great book on the economics of poverty, Tony Atkinson's book on measuring poverty around the world. That is the concept that we stay with. So I want to introduce a different notion. And this notion is very simple. You can probably guess where I'm going with this. This notion, this higher frequency notion, begins with recognition that people move through poverty through the year, households experience rises and falls, exits and entries, and then in many ways, and I don't want to be too glib about this, but in many ways, instability is a stable feature of the lives of other criminals. We're going to take that idea seriously. We're going to take Kabani's experience seriously. And you can see the possibility to ask, what if we measure poverty according to this row at the bottom, these ones and zeros, where we account for the months where she's poor and the months she's not. Before showing that, technically, I just want to say this is an idea that grew out of work in Bangladesh, grew out of work in many countries, actually. But it's also a situation that's as true in the United States. When we look at high-frequency data in the United States, we also see that people move in and out of poverty with frequency. The median length of experience of poverty in national data in the US is 11 months, so under a year, but a third, 35% of the US population was in poverty for at least 2 contiguous months, and about 35% of poverty spells, experiences of poverty, ended within 6 months. So this idea that being poor means being poor all year doesn't hold up in the US. And for those of us who are working on RCTs, increasingly work is showing how important seasonality is in understanding the lives of low-income households. And sure, can list off a series, this is a group of recent RCTs, which make a point of showing the illiquidity and instability and how they affect low-income households and some possible solutions. But all of that is left out of conventional discussions of poverty. I'm trying to bring it back in. So if we go back to our hypothetical data, you can see that there's a broad group of months, these yellow months, these yellow squares. About half of them register experiences of poverty. And to capture them, we propose a very simple measure, which is just this. Just measure poverty month by month. It could be a head count, it could be a Watts measure, it could be a foster career effect measure, which accounts for the depth of poverty, but month by month. And so if someone is poor for 7 months, they contribute 7/12 of a year of poverty to the annual average. And so it's simply an extension, pulling apart the conventional measure and aggregating over time as well as over year. So we call this the average of poverties. And in this case, in the hypothetical data, the average of poverties is interpretable easily as the fraction of the year, on average, that people experience poverty. So it also is a very simple interpretation and notation. It's also time sensitive. It measures ins and outs of poverty. It shows that if people could smooth consumption, could borrow more easily, could save more easily, could share more easily, could receive benefits more easily. That could reduce poverty, especially targeted to worse off moments. I guess the question that I want to turn to next, and maybe this is something I didn't see for a long time. I want to unpack this argument. Is that, well, it seems like, at first when I started talking about this with people, they said, that's interesting, but it's just something you academics think of. It's not really feasible. We're just going to collect that kind of data. We don't have those kinds of data sets to measure poverty month by month. And so I want to take you to what to me was an unexpected step in this argument. I want to show how de facto poverty rates, actual poverty rate in India, for example, approximates this high frequency concept. So that what's called poverty in India, I want to argue, measured by the National Sample Survey, actually approximates this idea I just put forward, does not approximate the conventional notion of poverty. I didn't expect that, and I want to argue about it. So the first part of this argument is that we collect data on consumption, and we use that consumption, we collectively, the global community, collects data on expenditure and consumption, and that's what we base poverty on in poverty measures. Every low-income country, 90% of lower middle-income countries, 62% of upper middle-income countries, and that's a big distinction between how the high-income countries collect data and most countries in the world. So we're focused on collecting data with expenditure, measuring poverty with expenditure. Now we use expenditure data because it's hard to collect income data when jobs are informal. Farmers, it's very hard to calculate costs and benefits, or costs and revenues, and figure out profits, and do that for every income stream. So we find it easier to collect data on expenditures, but even that's difficult. And if I ask you, what did you consume last week, you might be able to tell me, but if I ask you, what did you consume 3 months ago, you might have a hard time. So to get more accurate data, we ask questions about expenditures, often with a short-term recall. So that's one important point. And the second part is that because of seasonality, if we're collecting data with short-term recall, really we should try to go back in different seasons and interview the same households. But because budgets are tight, most statistical agencies only interview households one time during the year. And these two observations, collecting data with short-term recall, only interviewing households once at some point during the year, but only once, in the context of seasonality and instability, is what together is going to, without deliberately doing so, lead measured poverty, national poverty rates, national poverty statistics, away from being what they're meant to be or interpreted as being to this second idea. And there's a lot of work we're building on measurement issues. Let me show where that goes. Now, when data gets collected, for example here in the National Household Surveys, not everything is collected with short-term recall. But Josh Morduch and I are looking at the Indian data. You can see the questions that were asked with short-term recall, which is mostly food, but some entertainment, rent, etc., accounted for over 3/4 of consumption or spending. And then there's some questions which were asked with a longer frame, but then attributed. And so we follow this path. So the point is that what's measured as household expenditure, if you get a household data set, crack it open, and look at a household expenditure variable, that variable is not actually average consumption for the year. What it is consumption rooted in the moment in which the households were entering. Now, if households could smooth consumption across the year, so this was stable across the year, it wouldn't matter when the surveyors came to interview a household. It would all be the same. You'd interview someone in April, their past month's expenditure would be the same as January. Wouldn't really matter. It's the fact that households have a hard time smoothing consumption that makes this a statistical problem as well. Similarly, if households could smooth consumption, statistical agencies could really cut costs, and many try to do this by just doing interviews in one part of the year. Let me just start in the first quarter, interview households then, but since households smooth consumption, it's fine, that's also representative of other parts of the year. But it's when households have lean seasons and better seasons, when living standards go up and down, as we know they do, that these strategies don't work. And these strategies lead to other outcomes. In a survey of surveys, we're looking at how countries around the world collect data, only 12% went back to the same households more than this. And so the expert guidelines for collecting data put forward a series of protocols that they see as being sort of the best way to collect data if one has to cut corners, which is, okay, ask questions with short-term recall. We know that's most accurate. When one collects data through the year to capture the seasonality, recognizing that, it's stratified. So collect random samples at different points of the year, and that's a key thing. And my understanding that's not done in Pakistan, but it's done in many other. And we sort of want to show what would happen if in Pakistan that is true. But that stratification is a key part of expert advice. And then the third point is interviewing only once if that's what's feasible. So taking these expert guidelines, I want to show you what happens. Drawing these random samples through the year. What happens then in the hypothetical data, and I'll show you some data from the NSS. What happens is we're just sampling then and getting 1 month per household. So those yellow squares, when we randomly sample month that these households are interviewed in. So instead of getting monthly data, instead of getting average data for the year, what we get are these samples. And those samples are kind of strange beasts, but if the sampling is done right, we can interpret them and make sense of the data. So you're going to capture people who are poor, but sometimes maybe we're catching them at a moment when they're not actually poor in that month. Similarly, we might get people who are not poor on an annual basis, but we're actually capturing them, say, during the lean season when they are poor. And what happens is we feed that data into the standard poverty measures. And when we do that, this sort of randomly selected data, this randomly selected months or quarters for households, when we do that, in expectation, we get a probability-weighted expectation, a probability-weighted sum of the household's experiences of poverty every year. We don't see that, but that's our expectation of what we're actually picking up. And when we then aggregate all that data across households, what we end up with in expectation is a form that is identical to this average of poverties that Josh Morduch and I laid out. And I'll show you that with some real data. So what we're going to do then, through this process, you as I said, you sort of get a rate that's exactly equal to this average of poverties. 50%. This is what things look like in the National Sample Survey. These are stratified across 4 quarters. And you can see that this quarter of the year, July, August, September, is the lowest quarter. So in the data, what's counted as household expenditure, when interpreted as being for the year, you can see that in the actual data, there's a clear seasonal pattern. This is the hardest time of the year for many poor households because it's the monsoon period, there's not a lot of outside work, and it's generally a difficult period of health. So I wanted to then take this idea and show some implications. Final. So to show how this works, we needed data that actually collects monthly data of the same households over time. There are not a lot of data sets that do that. There's one in China, some others. There's one that you may be familiar with, the intercept data from rural. This round between 2010 and 2015 collected monthly data for up to 5 years for the same households over time. And that gives us a chance to collect data on the actual measure that we put forward, this average of poverty, and also to mimic what would happen if data were collected using expert guidelines for data collection. These are rural households. It's not representative of India. It's different from Pakistan, but similar to other parts of the semi-arid tropics, including the belt across the middle of Sub-Saharan. It's a place with a lot of seasonality, and so what we see here, maybe a more intensified version of what we would see in other countries. So the first thing is, if we take our data, we can actually measure consumption over the year because we have the whole series of monthly realizations. And you can see that the poverty line that would be calculated conventionally leads us to 29% of the households in the sample being poor over this period. But if we calculate this idea of the average poverty and include ups and downs of people through the year in terms of their experiences of poverty, we get a much higher number. There's much more experience of poverty than is revealed in the conventional approach. 37% of months in the sample are experiencing poverty. What that says is you can see that households to smooth their consumption, the poverty rate in the sample would converge to the lower level. So in that sense, one of the key things I'm trying to put forward here is that consumption smoothing, liquidity, borrowing and saving, and being able to get hold of money, just like that man, the migrant worker I was speaking to last week in Mumbai, just like he was saying, the poverty is bound up with not having the right amount of money at the right time. And we can see it in the data. I want to show that. This is a visualization that Josh Morduch made. I am too old to be able to code this up. But what Josh did here is to take our sample, where we see months, the complete realization of monthly data, and to do 1,000 draws of 1 month for each household, and then measure poverty based on that. And you can see what's happening is that in these random samples that are being selected, mimicking how countries around the world actually do collect data, you can see that it's piling up on this average of poverty measure. It's not piling up on the conventional poverty measure. In other words, I think there's a temptation to see these issues with seasonality as sort of noise. Noise gives us a noisy measure of poverty. This is showing something quite different, importantly different. It's not a noisy measure of conventional poverty. It's a distinctly, precisely approximated measure of this other concept of poverty. Share the year people are poor. So a few implications. One, when we think about people being poor or not poor, we tend to think about people always being poor or then never being poor. We sort of exit poverty, escape poverty. And what we're able to see is that, in fact, this one is the poverty line, so to the left is people below the poverty line, to the right is people who are not in poverty based on their average consumption over the year. But during the year, the vertical axis gives us the share of the year that people are experiencing poverty. And you can see that this clear distinction between being poor and not poor is not clear in practice. In fact, there's a continuum, and in fact, people who are above the poverty line are still spending a fraction of the year in poverty. What we're seeing is that people who are 50% on average above the poverty line based on their annual consumption, they're still spending about a quarter of the year experiencing poverty, usually in lean season. Households with the poverty line are spending about 60% of the year in poverty. And these changes are happening because you've got people, this is the poverty line, who are spending part of the year below it, and some who are spending part of the year above it. But there are a lot of people who are above the poverty line, so that movement of non-poor people who are sometimes poor dominates in the data. Similarly, and I won't stress this too much, but when we think about exiting poverty and entering poverty, which is what we would see on the left-hand side, is either you're poor or you exited poverty, you were poor last year but not this year. We think about that as a distinct state, and then people who are entering poverty, they're poor this year but not last year. But on the right-hand side, you can see that actually what's happening when we talk about exit and entry, it's really just a shift in the amount of time spent below the poverty line. And that even people who've been not poor, as conventionally measured, for, say, 2 years, are still spending more than a quarter of the year below the poverty line. The two final things. The first of the final things is that we then we have in our data set semantic metric measures, weight and height. And so we're interested in how these different concepts of poverty predict weight and height. And so we ran a lasso here, including the annual poverty concept and also this monthly concept, which allows for entry and exit. And what we see is that the lasso just completely drops the annual measures. There's more information content in this notion of poverty household by household in terms of how poor they are over the year. And partly it's because it includes people who are not poor, but sometimes poor, and can explain their situation. The final thing then is these increases in measured poverty. I showed you this, an increase from the poverty line, normalized to 1 there. This, once we include months of poverty, experiences of poverty, that increases by 26%. We can do the same thing with the Watts measure, the Foster-Greenberg measure, and here the difference is even starker. Because it's really capturing depths of poverty that are averaged out of the traditional measure. The increase by 48% in the measure, and that's largely due to people who are poor, who have even poorer moments than average. And bringing that back into the policy conversation. So, we've covered a lot of ground. I'm trying to bring this together with a few conclusions. The first is, I'm not arguing that we should necessarily abandon the way that we've been thinking about poverty for all of these decades. It's a powerful idea, it's a simple idea, it's very powerful both in our analysis and in our policy advice and development. But it also obscures the realities, important realities, fundamental realities that households live with. It just obscures those challenges, and also, from a statistical standpoint, it requires much more data to calculate than we actually typically have in the data sets we have. And I think we haven't realized that. We've just sort of proceeded as if we were collecting that object, but we're not. This idea that Josh and I have focused on, this average of poverty idea, we're not advocating for it either, but we are saying that if you follow expert guidelines for collecting data, that is what you get. That is the de facto measure of poverty in many countries. Here in Pakistan, it's not exactly that because the stratification looks different. In fact, my sense is in Pakistan, what we think of as the poverty rate isn't quite the average of poverty, but isn't the conventional poverty measure either. I think in most countries that's actually the situation. But the Pakistan poverty rate is much closer to the average poverty. Put forward the average of poverty's idea than the conventional poverty. So this is surprising. I gave a talk at the World Bank a few months ago to the group that's working on the LSMS and the data collection. They haven't really, even though they work every day intensively sort of pulling these pieces together, working with the data, they haven't really pieced this together. And then together we start to sort of see how this works. So moving forward, where do we go? First, both of these poverty concepts are helpful. They're easy to interpret. One is the share of the population that's poor on average. It's harder to collect. The other is the share of the year that people experience poverty. It's easier to collect, but it's its own concept of poverty. So the first thing that would be useful would be for the World Bank or some other agency to do a better job of cataloging not just poverty rates and not just poverty lines, but exactly how surveys are created and how sampling is done. Because that turns out to determine actually the content of what these poverty rates really mean. The second thing that would be helpful is to expand compliance with expert guidelines. To stratify by quarters, for example, rather than to survey households through the year, but to do it, say, geographically. One could stratify, one would have a sort of clearer sense of what's being used. My final thought is one that people think a lot more about, and maybe your thoughts on, which is a more philosophical question. I started with this question, what is poverty? And what I've laid out for you is this notion that what we see as poverty, that we measure as poverty, isn't what we think it is. So that's one answer to what is poverty. But there's a philosophical question. How do people experience poverty? What is the ethical concern? What's the moral philosophy of poverty? Where would that take us? Could you be poor for a week? Maybe not. Could you be poor for a day? Probably not. It doesn't rise to the level of philosophical concern. But could you be poor for a month? Perhaps. Be poor for a season? I think so. Thinking about these possibilities can lead us to a clearer vision of what we're actually trying to do as development economists guiding policy. And in newer work, we're turning to hunger, we're turning to inequality, because the same kind of statistical issues come up in those conversations. So thank you. And I hope that these ideas were some thoughts, and I look forward to some conversation.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. I think we'll be thinking about these ideas for quite a while. I'd like to invite Dr. Morduch if he has any remarks before we go into the Q&A session.
So very quickly, just off the cuff here, I think it's a great way of looking at it from some of the work that experienced the rural sport programs. You look at shocks, especially medical shocks, and how that can put people into poverty, sickness, selling of animals and death. And one measure of what is poverty is something said not having friends is poverty. Because they send your social sort of networks and that really are the safety nets to smoothen out that, help smooth out that cycle of consumption. But I think this gives a great idea from the table.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Very nice meeting with you. I'm Jonathan Morduch from Masters in Summer, Professor of Health Economics. My question is very simple. Because you said smooth consumption reduces poverty. But the person, he or she, had earned less than $2, and normally the concept of smooth consumption is the balance between the saving and spending. But the person having anything less than $2, he has no saving. How can smooth consumption is helpful in reducing poverty rather than we normally want to say that the education and health is key in the direction of poverty? Thank you.
one thing I was expecting to be my bad is that, when we move from this traditional measure to high frequency measure, how would the policy options be changing? Especially like if I think about, let's say, the policy, the target, the growth, and growth is average, and average across sectors, average across seasons more often in most of the developing countries. So any poverty alleviation strategy that relies on growth dynamics to take care of it might be different in the traditional measures versus high frequency. Cash transfers could do a very different job. For example, if the cash transfers are, aligned with this seasonality in many of the sectors of the countries that we observe. So what is your take on that? And would there be some really radical differences in policies, or we will still continue with the traditional development areas?
It's a fascinating paper. It's great to hear talk through it. I was sort of talked about it at the end that should we really think about poverty as weekly or daily. But I was thinking about it as well that would the estimates look very different if we were to estimate it based off daily or weekly data, if it ever exists. But thinking about what Bakaus was saying as well, we know about daily loans, we know about daily lending as well that happens in many parts of the world. So it seems like people have demand for products that allows them to do consumption over days or even a week. So then it seems like it is important maybe to think about poverty measurement
This is really interesting. So I have one clarification, which is basically how is this different from the concept of vulnerability? And the second is your thoughts on the implication for measures like the MPI, or in the case of Pakistan, where we have the NSCR, which is looking at multidimensional measures of poverty, but in itself, it is also the things that are listed, the 23 things that are in there are also based on consumption measured at a particular point in time. So is that still going to be as biased, let's say, as just having an absolute measure of poverty, in our opinion?
How are we doing on time? How much time do we have?
What time the session?
So the next session starts at 11:30. 11 to 11:30 was the tea break, so we can take another 5 minutes.
Okay. All right. So I think Professor Morduch is going to answer the questions so far, and then we'll take a couple more before tea.
Yeah. Thanks for these questions. I really was first studying this, this idea of not having friends is poverty is an idea that, as development economists, as policy experts, policy implementers kind of understand. And really what this work is trying to do is keep that set of ideas, but integrate it into poverty writ large, which is the first sustainable development goal, but which is viewed at such an aggregate macro level. So the realm of growth and all of that, alongside that annual aggregates like GNP, we really want to argue that actually if we take that measure seriously and see what it's actually telling us, that it gets us closer to understanding how, thinking about social networks, thinking about micro relationships, thinking about the kinds of things we're thinking about at this conference, that's actually part of measured poverty as well. Even though right now it's seen as this separate silo. And I'm not arguing that on longer grounds, at least only in part, I'm saying that is the state of affairs. The measures that we have around the world are already reflecting, say, the strength of people's social networks. And then the question for policy is, how can we strengthen that? Now, maybe a policy could be to help people have more friends. I don't think that's a very workable policy, but for example, we're going to see some papers later today on cash transfers, and tomorrow on cash transfers, they targeted flooding times or particularly low seasons. One policy is that cash transfers, which are to push toward these more difficult times might have a bigger impact on measured poverty than more neutral policies. Similarly, when we think about microfinance is often described in terms of helping people increase their earning power and thus their average earnings. We say when we see people who spend that money buying food or grain or other provisions, we say that's a violation of the idea of microfinance. That's not going to help address poverty. But in fact, in terms of what we're actually measuring, it can reduce poverty by helping people have the right resources when they need it and maintain consumption levels through the year. I'd really like to raise this question about sort of time periods, and I think that's a really important direction to go in. Things would look different if we measured poverty by the day or by the week. And it's true, households have pretty good ways usually to address this. And so in terms of policy, it puts a focus on these medium-term consumption smoothing challenges, not from year to year, but from season to season. And what we're seeing in a series of RCTs is that that's a particularly difficult challenge for households. But how's it different from vulnerability? It's not really, at some level. But what I'm trying to say is that concept of vulnerability is also in its own silo, right? It's, people like us who like thinking about concepts like vulnerability and we write papers and such. What I want to say is that those concepts are actually already part of, not distinct from, but part of measured poverty in the framework that countries around the world inadvertently are already de facto using. And so it's not something walled off. It's actually something integral. We just need to see it more clearly. And I think I'll end there.
I also have a quick question, and then I know there are several other questions here. I wanted to ask what this understanding of poverty, how that would affect, let's say, the evaluation of policies that are sort of targeting poverty, so anti-poverty programs. What implications do these measurement issues have for that evaluation? And would then one want to try to measure both types of poverty, like reducing day-to-day poverty, month-to-month poverty, and raising average incomes as well? Do we take separate measures of those? Anyways, that was my question, and I think I saw Dr. Naved had a question, and we have some more questions over here. Let's take these two questions, plus, I do start, and we'll take these two questions too.
I think Jonathan went on in that direction with regard to microfinance. Traditionally, we've seen that microfinance, the results show they haven't had that impact which we were expecting in terms of capital accumulation and moving up. But maybe this role of microfinance, smoothing consumption, should be actually made more integral. And therefore, then the product could change, I assume, from a one-year loan, which is paid equally every month, to short-term loans, which are made available and things like that. That was my question is, do you see microfinance evolving into this kind of product which allows people to smooth consumption and would be feasible?
My question was very similar to what was asked before. So I was also trying to understand, so in terms of the policy implications, now anti-poverty program should just not be about raising incomes, but more about helping people save when they earn more. So it's more of a savings issue than rather just an issue of raising incomes. Is that right?
Thank you for the presentation. You showed very nicely how it can be problematic for us to measure it on an annual basis. But then, what are your thoughts on what that measure should be? You talked about monthly, you get a question on weekly and daily. But then, as you said, consumption varies significantly. If people have seasonal access to revenue and they're purchasing more items day as opposed to like a week, like how do you determine what that good point in time is for us to look at it? Because obviously your consumption will change, you store things, you ration, and those sorts of things. And then part two would be of how would it vary if instead of consumption we focus also on the income and what assets do you have and how liquid those assets are. Because I might not be consuming because I've already spent the money, but that doesn't mean I'm poor because I could still have money that I'm choosing not to spend. So how would all of that relate?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in an ideal world, I would like to see both of these notions of poverty being part of a poverty evaluation. Low-income households themselves are very concerned with high-frequency deprivations, and recognizing that and building that into poverty evaluations makes sense, while not losing sight of the broader challenge of raising earning power, etc. It's not one versus the other. Yeah, it's interesting with microfinance. They're part of a very unsuccessful series of interventions I've made over the years has been to argue, and unsuccessful in the sense of struggling to get people to embrace these ideas, has been arguing that microfinance actually already is often used for consumption smoothing. Roughly about half of loans, well, they're set up, people say they're taking them to start a small business. We're seeing roughly half of the money is being used for consumption smoothing already. But by not recognizing it, as you're saying, we're not then optimizing the products for those purposes. People are always creative. They'll take a loan where they can get it, they'll use it however they use it. I would like to see more transparent products which are optimized. So it would be shorter term products, usually, which embrace that rather than saying, oh, that's terrible to use loans for consumption. At least around the world, of course, that's exactly what people do and need to do. The question, am I saying that really this is about saving, not just raising incomes? Yes and no. It's not just about saving. It's also about borrowing, as we're saying. It's about social networks. It's about public policy. It's about all of the different tools that people use. So we talk about a portfolio. All of those people can draw on when they need to get hold of resources. Usually when there's a challenge, people draw down savings and they're borrowing at the same time and they're going to neighbors all at the same time. So it's not just one strategy. And the final question is about what this measure, I'm sort of thinking more broadly about other kind of measures like income and assets. I think that's super important. I just would say one thing that's more technical. When one thinks about measuring poverty in terms of consumption, one has to be very careful with durables and larger purchases. This has a sort of flavor of your question. And so people could spend a lot in one season about clothing, about whatever, and could consume it for a long time. And so, yeah, that's one of the big challenges in the data, to have sensible resources. Thank you.
All right, I think we should probably break for tea so that we don't fall behind schedule. I know that we all probably